Thank you everyone for taking time and tuning in to listen to all of us today talk about project management. Before we get started, I want to highlight that we are doing this as part of our project work for a course that all of us are attending with XLRI. Human Capital Leadership is the course that we are all part of, and any resemblance to any talk show, live or not live, is purely coincidental. Now, to get us started with our discussion, let me invite our first guest speaker for today, who will talk about what is this project that we are going to discuss today. Jolene, I'm going to invite you to talk about that.
Thank you, Samesh. Now, for the opportunity to speak on this space. In 2000, all right, I guess it was a little bit of an overlap, but I'll quickly cut to the chase. In 2000, the government of Maharashtra brought out a government resolution stating that Maharashtra will operationalize an innovative community-driven approach in water management in rural areas. So until this time, the Maharashtra Jeevan Pradhikaran and the Zilla Parishad, in essence, the state's two official arms, had been entrusted with the task of identifying water and sanitation supply needs of all rural communities. But this time around, the responsibility of implementation of the project was assigned to the state's water supply and sanitation department. Now, again, according to the government resolution, the village residents had little to say in all these matters and were also not required to pay for any of these services. At that time, 73% of the villages were fully covered with potable water supply services, 24% were partially covered, and the remaining 1.73% were not covered at all. So despite spending a whopping 166 million rupees, 26% of the rural inhabitants at that time did not have assured water supply throughout the year, and the majority of the inhabitants received intermittent water supply intensified by the government's operations and maintenance machinery not being up to the mark. This situation was worse during the summer when water supply dried up and the villages depended on the water supply through tankers. So that's a little bit of a background on the project, Sumesh, but I'll hand it over to your capable hands to take this forward.
Yeah, thank you, Jolene. I think you kind of encapsulated what this project is all about beautifully. I'm going to quickly move from you to someone who will probably help us set a little more context. Parikshit, if I can bring you in to talk a little bit about why did we select this particular project as part of our project work?
Thank you, Sumesh. So in continuation to Jolene's point, the trifecta that affected the long-term, sustainable water supply in villages, there were primarily three reasons. The first being the prevailing problems in rural water supply in the areas of non-participation. The second was the lack of capacity building of communities to own and manage the infrastructure. And thirdly, was the lack of standardized engineering designs and technology for water management. So for this, obviously the state government decided, they had to do something about it. So they decided to adopt the Government of India's sector reform policy that provided guidelines based upon one, participation of communities, secondly, driving of the program through Panchayat Raj institutions, and thirdly, the long-term sustainability of services through technical and management operations by local communities. So this is what led to the birth of Jalswarajya, and hence we decided that this should be a very good topic to choose for our project, and in reference to explain the concepts of project management. Thank you, Sumesh.
Absolutely, Parikshit. I couldn't agree more. It has all the nuances that people really encounter when we talk about project management. It has a mix of operational work that has to be done, the efficiency that has to be brought about, and also the critical aspect of people. But hey, I don't want to spill the beans right now. Let's move on to one key concept that we heard our professor talk to us right through our session. And this was so loud and clear that I heard it in my bed as well. Jolene, what is it about the triple constraint that our professor really spoke about, and what is it that we should be aware about?
Thanks, Umesh, again. Now, this project operated on three constraints. The first one being the scope of the project. Here, the Jalswarajya project was selective and restricted only to those villages where the quantity of and quality of available water and sanitation facilities was below par. There was a high presence of below poverty line and tribal families, and also had a good track record of paying water dues to the government in earlier state-run schemes. Jal Swarajya was designed to benefit around 7.5 million rural inhabitants and estimated to benefit around 10 million by the end of the project period. The second constraint that I think all of us are only too familiar with is time management, as this project was to be completed in just 18 months. Jal Swarajya was chosen to be launched in a village panchayat that took the initiative on information, education, and communication activities. The activities were interdependent and followed a sequence containing three major phases under which key outputs were specified. These phases were community planning, community implementation, and operational maintenance. Now, the third and the last constraint was cost. A project has to have a balance, let me repeat that. A project has to be a balance one of all three constraints. And most projects sadly fail because we try to balance all three. However, Manju from our team will speak a little more about budget and cost in detail as we progress. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Jolene. And just for everyone who is tuned in today, the three constraints that we are talking about is scope, time, and cost. If you keep these three things in mind, you have taken that first step towards managing a project. Great. Let me bring in another speaker on this panel today. Sonam, let me invite you to speak to all of us about what were some of the key objectives of this project.
Sure, Sumesh. Thank you so much. So this Jal Swaraj project had two objectives. Firstly, first objective was to increase rural households' access to improved and sustainable drinking water and sanitation services. The second objective was to institutionalize decentralization of rural water supply and sanitation service delivery to rural local governments and committees. So these were the two objectives that the project had. Over to you,
Wow.
Sumesh.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Sonam. And just hearing those objectives as you spell that out, I can very well relate to why this is such a critical project for the government to really undertake. And before I move to our next panelist, for everyone, Jolene spoke a little bit about cost. And one of the key aspects of managing cost is how you manage budget. Now, budget allocation in a project like this is absolutely critical. And to help us get an insight on that is someone who we call the researcher in our group. Manju, with that, may I invite you to talk a little bit about the budget allocation?
Thank you, Sumesh. So the project was funded by International Development Association, the World Bank, the Government of India, and the Government of Maharashtra. The total cost of this project was $235 million US, of which 70% was funded by the World Bank and the International Development Association, and 30% was funded by the Government of India and Maharashtra. Of this 235 million, 70% of this budget was used to develop the community, the rural community, and 20% of this was allocated to institutional strengthening. And the remainder 10% was directly used to strengthen the rural water supply. And that's a little bit about budget allocation.
Oh, super. Thank you. And one key takeaway as Manju speaks about that allocation is this is how budget management is done when you know what amount needs to be really spent on the different aspects that would really make this project successful. Now, from cost, we get to the part that really makes or breaks a project. This is about stakeholders, right? But before we deep dive into that conversation, let me invite Rachita to provide us a sneak peek on who were the different stakeholders involved in this project. Rachita, all yours.
Hi, Sumesh. As we hear, the stakeholder is most important. Is the most important person in the whole project management charter which we do. So we need to understand the expectations as well as the objectives so that all the parties are at the same level. That's what we do in the stakeholder management. In this Jal Swaraj project, there was many stakeholders identified. So there were categories which were identified in this. One was the demand side and other was the supply side. On the demand side, we had women and household beneficiary. Now, why women? Because women are the important stakeholders when it comes to manage the water at the home. Hence, they had put in 50% of the quota for the women in all the committees which were formed. And the other one was the household beneficiary, which included all your scheduled tribes, all your backward class, all the below poverty line people. Also, they included children so that they could help them understand the importance of water and the sanitization. Now, as we saw the demand side, now what is the supply side of this project? It was mainly because of the government department and the government of Maharashtra. Now they had defined into 3 layers in the stakeholder management in the government of Maharashtra, where first level was village level, the second was at Zilla Parishad, and the third one was at the state level. Now, when they defined all these 3 categories, it's basically they were going a bottom down approach and the top down approach at the same time. So hence they included the last level of the village level, that is your talatis, your anganwadis, everyone, the gram sevak. So it was the like going at the lowest level to manage the stakeholders. The last but not the least is your community based organizations. Those are your self-help groups, your non-organization non-government organization and the Mahila Mandals who help them move ahead in explaining what is the concept of water and the sanitization. The last was the funding agencies, is the main crux of the whole project where the money comes. So yeah, the World Bank and the government of India and other Germany-based companies which were part of this. That's it from my side. That's all the stakeholders for the Jal Swaraj.
Brilliant, right? And you scared me for a moment when you said demand and supply. I thought we are talking about economics, and my love for economics was visible. But that aside, but thank you. I think that gives us a background to build the conversation on. These were all the stakeholders that really needed to be brought together. But how did the stakeholders come together? Sonam, if I can bring you back to this conversation to talk a little bit about how did they go about engaging all the stakeholders?
Sure, Sumesh. Thank you once again. So in order to engage the stakeholders throughout this project, several initiatives were taken, like community stakeholder communication, community negotiation, community capacity building. Talking about the first one, which is community stakeholder communication, among other items in the checklist, one of the sub-projects was to communicate with villagers through informal and formal discussions about their approach to the different components of the project. Taking into account the diverse nature of the village demography, communication with the community stakeholder was a major challenge. So to remedy that, some unusual and creative solutions were developed to introduce the appropriate direction among the villagers, who were the key stakeholders. The project management team conducted exposure visits to other villages where Jal Swaraj was in operation, alongside organizing group meetings to explain the project scope. As reading material was not preferred by the villagers, there were other methods like posters, audiovisual tools, wall paintings, and radio talks. They were used to sensitize the villagers. These are just a few of the methods that the team used to drive engagement and acceptance for the project. The next initiative which was taken was community negotiation. At the community negotiation stage, various village level project committees, village level volunteers, and Gram Sabha officials undertook the responsibility of formulating the most appropriate communication and negotiation options for the village. The NGOs too used various negotiation techniques to manage internal conflicts and align various village sections to focus on the core objective. The project committee representatives found collaborating or mutual problem solving and accommodating as the most effective approach for negotiation with beneficiaries of schemes. However, at times, a combination of approaches was used to drive project objectives and achieve community agreement. So, and the next initiative that was taken for engaging this with the stakeholders was community capacity building. Components of community capacity building, which ensured a high level of transparency and also created a sense of identification with the cause. They were identified and deployed at project sites. It helped bring all layers of village society to conduct meetings around the project and to impart training to the village water supply and sanitation committee. Lastly, to involve stakeholders in managing the project. This was also one of the the key initiatives that was taken, because Jalswaraj project was run as a pilot project in 3 districts, which was completed successfully. So the main project was launched in 26 districts of Maharashtra. After that, a detailed project implementation plan was circulated to all the stakeholders so that they could engage with the stakeholders. Also, the stakeholders could get involved directly in the project management. So that's about the engagement of stakeholders. Sumesh, back to you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sunam. And I loved what you called out, because it talks about you do certain things which are tried and tested, that works. You kind of shift change based on who you are engaging with, and that's where the innovation comes about. And at times you have to bring in a mix of both these methods to really engage the stakeholders.
Correct.
So we spoke about who the stakeholders were. We spoke a little bit about how did we engage these stakeholders. I'm guessing there must have been some challenges as well, right? Rachita, considering you spoke about who the stakeholders were, can you spell out what were some of the challenges as well?
Sure, Sumesh. There were multiple levels of challenges faced, both in terms of the stakeholder and other than that was the project, the water, the kind of water, the other project implementation, the procurement challenges. But I would more stress on the stakeholder challenges. So there were 3 types of challenges which I could broaden it up. The first one was the channel of communication. As Sonam was talking, because most of the villages are not like literate, so the education and the system is not so I guess if we compare it to the urban, the villages would be a little bit lesser than that. Hence to identify the mode of communication was a major task. The second one was the onboarding the diversity candidates, as in the prima facie, if the project got successful because of the women being part of this project. Hence getting women out of the house and help learning new techniques and making them teach and go to the school and learn was a major task. Being from a village and from the the backward caste and the backward tribe, women coming out of the house was a challenging task. Out of all this, the third one was the community participation. Now, when we put it up the task onto each and every villages and the sub villages and the community where they had to come out and be part of this whole project, there were a lot of hindrance towards it. One of the reason was Watson project, which was the large irrigation project which was happening around at that time. I mean, it was just like a 2-3 months prior to this project. It failed and the result was not that great, and hence because of this the participation from the community was a major task. What approach they did in this project was bottom down approach and as well as a top down approach, which I mentioned in my stakeholder. So they went ahead and made a chartered plan which was page wise description and very clarity in terms of having when there will be a meeting and all the plans, objectives, whenever they are going to meet, everything was detailed out and posted on all the village panchayatis. That is how they try to gain community trust, and that's how they moved ahead.
Yeah, very well called out, Rachita, right? So what it also tells me is, yes, there were challenges, but they had identified those challenges beforehand, probably some of it, and they had some plans to mitigate the challenges as well. One of the key components of project management, by the way, right, where you identify the risk and then you figure out a plan on how can that risk be mitigated as we move ahead. Thank you. We heard about all the stakeholders and how they were engaged, what were some of the challenges. Now, how do you really communicate with the stakeholders? That's one key question that has bothered me all this while. But Manju actually is going to give us a power interest matrix that explains this different modes of engagement with the stakeholders. Manju, let me pull you in into the conversation.
Thanks, Umesh. So the power matrix is a very important matrix that we need to look when we are managing stakeholders. So the politicians and Zilla Parishads comprising of 4 groups: the district water management and the sanitation committee, the district facilitation team, the district appraisal and monitoring team, district financial management team. They had a high power, and they were driving this project. The Women and the Tribal Development Program made sure that the most important stakeholders, the women, are compulsory attending all the Gram Sabha meetings, and made sure that 50% of the meetings were comprising of women. And they had a high interest because they were driving the project from the ground level. Operations and the monitoring team had a high power and high interest because they ensured that the stakeholders from the demand and the supply worked together and made this project success. The NGOs, community organizations like Mahila Mandal, self-help groups had a low power and interest, but they played an active role on community mobilization. The community beneficiaries, the funding agencies like the World Bank, IDA, Government of India, Maharashtra, and had a high interest because they were heavily invested and making this project very successful. That's a better
Super.
word.
Yeah, absolutely right. And to everyone listening to our conversation, as you prepare for rolling out a project, an absolutely critical step for you to do is to identify who your stakeholders are. And based on the power interest matrix that Manju just spoke about, identify how would you communicate with them. Someone who has high interest and high power vis-a-vis someone who has low interest and low power, you cannot be communicating the same style with them. Great. We are almost getting there, getting our concepts together, but let's make it absolutely explicit. And someone who says things explicitly is taking our next question. Parikshit, let's get to you and hear a little bit about what were some of the key project management principles that were used as part of this project.
Sure. Thank you, Sumesh. So, I mean, of course, having principles or a vision or a mission is extremely critical for something like a project like this. So, I mean, I can sum it up, in terms of principles. Of course, there are a lot more, but the key highlights would be 4. The first one being, obviously, they need to know the project vision. Because it's the vision that really encapsulates the purpose of the project, or why is it there, or what is the fixed end goal for the project team. They need to obviously identify the objectives and determine the scope. That's the first point. The second point is to basically describe the project system, as in what exactly is included. Like, the succeeding step is basically to identify how the project will be structured by listening to, all the key parties, that is the clients, the stakeholders, the functions, responsibilities, the reporting lines. So primarily, the customers, the different roles, the stakeholders, and the structure. That is what would be included. The third part, or the third principle, so to say, would be the implementation approach, or how exactly is it going to happen. They obviously need to have a fair idea regarding the implementation, a more detailed approach of, consisting of the points, like, for example, an implementation plan, what would be the specific milestone, the dependencies, what is the exact resource plan. These are all critical points. And of course, the last but not the least is the risk analysis and the management. Risk at any point of time. I mean, especially for a project like this, they have to have a calculated risk. This is primarily like the last step needed, to complete the project charter, and, to specify any project dangers, any specific issues, any constraints related to the project. So, I mean, that's about it from my end, Sumesh. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Parikshit. Love the way you summarized those key principles that we can really take back with us. As student of project management, as you look at the project that we just discussed, and if you have to tie it back with the project management principles, hear what Parikshit just called out in terms of how it was implemented. Jolene, if I can get you one last time to really help summarize this entire conversation, what are some of the key things that you would want to leave our audience today with?
Happy to do that, Sumesh. Now, the Jalswarajya project was an innovative one. Never before had a project been conceived by the government with the active and continuous involvement of the community in village development and in the running of the project. It was a complete bottom-up approach that transferred responsibility to run the scheme to the community on a demand basis. There were a series of process innovations dealing with small actions and problem solving by persons directly involved with the job that enabled the successful completion of a job. Now, while the big I of innovation happens once, the long-term success of any project is a result of continuous incremental innovation characterized by the small I. The Jalswarajya project demonstrated these in ample measure. The success of the project can be attributed to the thorough capacity building exercise, which played an integral part in all aspects of the project's stakeholder and project management. Now, the closing date of the project was September 30, 2009. Until then, the village level's response to the water and sanitation services demonstrated that 38% of the project stakeholders were extremely satisfied, while 62% were satisfied with the project outcome. The same survey found that the service delivery was satisfactory and had no issues in terms of collecting water tax, participation of community in the ongoing activities, or the breakdown of service. So these are some of the key takeaways from Project Jalswarajya, and I hope it's given you an overview of what we did.
Right, absolutely, Jolene. Appreciate how you brought all of this together. Been a welcome change for you. You did not see our panelists speak over each other. They kind of waited for their turn. They knew what they were speaking about, and they did not try to prove their point by raising their voice. So welcome to this change that you encountered today. And with that, we are going to sign off for today with Sonam, Rachita, Jolene, Parikshit, Manju, and Sumesh. Thank you for watching.